The Dallas Cowboys have had a lot of success signing spring league players. Could they find another one this offseason? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. On today's show, we are discussing the 4 workouts that the Cowboys did on Tuesday with some UFL players. We'll talk about what they're looking for, the potential prospects, and how they could fit into their defense. But Landon, let's talk about this trend of signing spring league players to help your roster in the NFL. The Cowboys have had a lot of success, whether it's last year, Brandon Aubrey, who was arguably the best kicker in the league, whether it was KaVontae Turpin, who is a Pro Bowl returner, his first year with the Cowboys. Do you expect this trend to continue? Not the all-pro success, but the Cowboys continuing to look at the spring league.
Yes, I expect them to sign a Pro Bowler from the UFL ranks this offseason. No, I mean, I think they clearly they've had a lot of success signing these UFL players. And I think, let's just take a step back. This is what this league is for. You know, this is why the NFL has wanted to try to support these leagues a little bit more, is because a spring league is good for the NFL. You know, it just provides more players the opportunity to get on the field. And look, football is unlike, many other sports, right? Where it's hard to play a game of football, an organized game of football, on the street, as the way it's played, professionally,
compared to basketball.
Yeah, you could play a
5-on-5.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. You can't. It's hard to get better at playing the actual sport of football, not flag football or 7-on-7. It's hard to get better at the actual sport of football because it's hard to organize a game in which you have, everyone in pads and everyone with refs. It's just a more difficult thing. So having a league out there for the class of players, and that's the shocking thing, is there is a large group of these kind of players who, fell through the cracks for one reason or another, needed a little bit more time to develop than they were afforded, maybe needed more snaps than they got the opportunity with their first chance in the NFL, or maybe some of these guys never made it to the NFL originally, but were good players that needed an opportunity to shine and needed to kind of get onto a team and show their stuff in front of everyone with like-minded players. And I think, that's a lot of what happened with Turpin, right? I mean, he had a situation in college that didn't get him drafted, and then he needed a showcase, right? Brandon Aubrey was a guy who didn't even go that route, was a professional soccer player, and then wanted to become a kicker. And there's not necessarily a way to showcase those skills outside of, getting into a game and showing people you can do it. So I think all these players have some sort of unique situation that has put them where they are, and the UFL is not just a scheme to get people more football in the spring. It's an opportunity for hundreds of players to get a second chance, or to get some of the development that they still needed in order to be good enough to make an NFL team.
I agree. First and foremost, I want to say I think there's a misconception that the UFL is they're trying to develop these players to become the next stars of the NFL.
Yeah.
That's not the case, right? You mentioned it. A lot of these players are just trying to get a second chance. And what I mean by a second chance is get invited to a camp or, make a 53-man roster where you have the chance of playing again. And for some players like DeAndre Baker and Garyon Conley, former first-round picks at cornerback, they just want to show that they can still play. And maybe that's only for another year or 2 years, but that makes a big difference when it comes to your pension and some of the health insurance stuff that you can get for the rest of your life. So that's another reason why these players are fighting so hard in a spring league to get back to the NFL. I do think it matters. We saw last year, Landon, there was 70 players from either the the AFL or the XFL that ended up making rosters. Now, again, a lot of the names aren't big name players. They're not guys that made a big impact, quote unquote, big impact last year, but it helps fill out some of the bottom of the roster. And I think that's what's really good. You mentioned it. It's you got to play football to get better at football. This is a really good opportunity for some players that maybe had a misstep or an injury to at least get back on the football field.
Yeah, I mean, for people that get their news about football news from ESPN and clips, like they may not ever hear of any of these guys. But for folks like y'all that are tuning in
The everydayers,
that are like know all the players on these teams and know their entire roster, like this is an exciting development because it just provides you another pipeline for talented players to kind of get onto your roster, right?
sure.
Instead of having to go find street free agents and like, hey, whatever happened to the 2019 draft class guy? That guy is coming to you by being on the DC Defenders and putting out, 12 games worth of tape, and you can actually see how that guy looks. It just provides an opportunity for these teams to see these players that, don't really have a ton of NFL. Well, some of them might have NFL experience, but
Some of them might. Yeah.
NFL experience to put actual tape out there and not just be a part of a workout. You can actually see these guys performing in an offense and performing in a defense. And that makes you that much more confident that they can make the transition into the NFL.
Not only that, there's also hundreds of players every year that I think have the talent to make an NFL roster, but they're just in a bad coaching situation in college or wherever. Where in the UFL, you've got some really good coaches, like Wade Phillips, right? Wade Phillips is one of the best coaches in the NFL. He goes to the UFL. It's not surprising to see his team doing very, very well there. Now you get to see how these players perform and react with NFL coaching. And I think that's really valuable sometimes just to see how they would look in a different scheme or a different system. I think that's really important. And the last thing I want to mention before we move on, and I've seen this take out there since it became news that the Cowboys were working out for UFL players. Now the Cowboys are showing interest in free agents now that it's UFL guys, not NFL guys. And this is what Jerry Jones meant by all in. This is kind of one of those Cowboys aren't going to get credit either way, right?
Yeah.
If they didn't work out guys, they're not doing their due diligence. If they are working out guys, well, why are they only looking at UFL free agents and not NFL free agents? It's really tiring. That's all.
Yeah. And look, I mean, talent acquisition is 365 days a year, I guess. And that doesn't help anybody that feels angry about the Cowboys free agent situation because it doesn't feel that way sometimes. But, I think, look, I mean, clearly they are trying to nibble around the edges a little bit until they can kind of solidify some of these bigger contracts that they're going to have to sign. I don't know that I necessarily agree with it or not, but it's the truth of the situation.
Oh, why not when you've had this much success? I mean, clearly the Cowboys, they've signed 2 Pro Bowlers. Now, I'm not saying they're going to do that again, but their track record's been pretty good at identifying talent from these spring leagues. Like, give them a little bit of trust here.
Yeah, and sometimes this is the kind of situation where this is how you get bargains. I mean, like these guys, maybe they're more talented than their situation implies, and so they're in a situation right now where their contracts are going to be cheap because they're trying to make the league, right? They're going
they're going to be vet minimum contracts.
So, but these are guys that also potentially might have more, upside than a well-worn street free agent who we know what he can do in the NFL. So, I mean, it's obviously this is not supposed to be in lieu of or in replacement of unrestricted free agency. It's just another avenue to kind of discover players that might have an opportunity to kind of surprise you and be better than you expected.
All right, let's talk about the 4 players that the Cowboys worked out on Tuesday and which one best fits their defense next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer that it gets to tip-off, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. You can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, and theater events near you. And save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. And you can save even more when you choose a section and you let Gametime choose your exact seats. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that unnecessary screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Landon, let's discuss the 4 players that the Cowboys have brought in for workouts. That includes Garyon Conley, a former cornerback from Ohio State, DeAndre Baker, a cornerback from from Georgia, Willie Harvey, who was with the Browns a few years ago, and then a linebacker, Noah Dawkins. Let's start with the 2 corners because those are obviously the 2 biggest name players here. What did you think of Conley and Baker coming in to the NFL? And what do you think about them now?
Well, to be honest, I prefer to get your take on Conley because you obviously had to cover him a little bit when he was with the Raiders, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
right? Baker, I'll tell you, I loved him coming out. I mean, I thought, he was a guy with just enough size, right? He's just a shy under 6 feet. He's just, a hair under 200 pounds, but he's got long arms. I'm pretty sure he's got like 32-inch arms. I thought that his profile really fit the kind of profile of a nickelback, right? A strong slot corner who could come in. He is physical. His tackling may not be all the way there or consistent, but I think he is a physical player. He's very smart. I mean, that's kind of his thing. Like, honestly, I remember very much kind of seeing a Jordan Lewis type player, like when you see him, where he's not physically overwhelming. He's not big or with a lot of size, and he's not like a blazer. I think he was a 4'5" guy. But I think he makes up for it with kind of savvy route recognition. He's a football player. He understands the angles. He understands the coverage he's in, and he understands where his help is in a lot of situations. So he just constantly is playing with the level of comfort that makes him play faster. And then obviously what happened is with him, he got drafted by the Giants. And then there was a legal situation that happened to him. The Giants involving an armed robbery situation that ended up being a case of extortion. He was being extorted by some other folks. He actually wasn't involved in the situation, in the crime. But at that point, the damage had already been done. The Giants had already cut him before that had gotten resolved. He played, I think, 2 years with Kansas City, right? After that. But in I think it's the last 2 seasons, he didn't play a ton. He played I think in a couple of games and had a handful of snaps, but he did kind of get into at least, I think, 8 or 9 games of each of the last 2 seasons. And then Kansas City let him go, and he ends up at the UFL and part of a pretty good team. So Baker's is probably the most interesting of these guys to me, at least, because I think he's the youngest of these guys, and probably the one that with the kind of most upside. But again, I'll add in all that stuff that I just said. I thought it looked like a great nickelback, a great slot corner. The problem with him, and this is kind of indicative of a lot of these UFL players, is that they had, an experience issue, but then there's also a second problem. The second problem for Baker, to me, is that he doesn't play slot corner. He doesn't play nickelback. He's almost exclusively an outside corner, was exclusively an outside corner at Georgia, was exclusively an outside corner in the UFL, it sounds like. I can't really speak to what he was doing at Kansas City, but I'm going to assume that it was a lot of outside corner there too. And I just don't know that is, like getting the most out of his skill set, right? And I think when you put him on the outside, he's a little bit undersized, he's a little bit slow, and that kind of knowledge, that increasing his speed, it doesn't quite make up for the kind of areas that he's lacking out in other spots. So I would say that he's definitely the most interesting of these four, but it's not like he doesn't have warts. It's not like there isn't a reason that this first round pick didn't get a big second opportunity after this case was dropped.
Yeah. So a couple of things really quickly, courtesy of PFF. DeAndre Baker actually had the third highest grade in all of the UFL when it comes to man coverage, which makes sense. I think the Cowboys are going to be running a lot of man coverage concepts this year. Wouldn't you assume? I mean,
they're probably going to have less than they did last year, but they were so high at it last year that I imagine even less would still be way more than most of the league.
So that's interesting. And maybe they're just looking at like, hey, can he be a outside man cornerback that we feel good about, maybe being our first guy off the bench? I think that's possible. Now, with a lot of these guys, it comes down to how much can you contribute on special teams. And that's ultimately what's going to decide if they can make the roster. But I think in terms of ability and age, probably Baker is the best name on this list. Gareon Conley's fascinating to me because his defensive coordinator for his entire career with the Raiders was Paul Guenther, who is the Cowboys linebacker / defensive assistant, right?
That part. Yeah.
Now they had him doing some wild stuff early in his career, a lot of off-man coverage, a lot of zone coverage, and he just wasn't used to it compared to what he did at Ohio State.
Yeah.
And he went to Houston. He played a little bit more traditional man-to-man defense, and he was better. And he stuck around for a while, but it wasn't great, right? Now I wonder with Gareon Conley, though, we're getting at the point of his career where he's getting a little bit older. And frankly, I didn't think he was that great in the UFL. If you look at the man-to-man grades, he had looking at the 7th worst man-to-man coverage grade of all the cornerbacks in the UFL. He had a game where he gave up over 100 yards in coverage. It's interesting from the sense that, I mean, obviously the Cowboys will know him well with Paul Guenther, but I think right now it's pretty clear that DeAndre Baker is the better of these two corners.
Let's also say, too, that there is legitimate, I would say, off the field stuff, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, we don't even need to get into all that, but like there is like actual concern there that Baker's was, it seems to be a case of extortion where Conley may have actually had some stuff. So
yeah,
it's just, there's a lot here, right? And ultimately, what's the upside? He has some size. He had some speed when he came out. This is a 6'2", 204 guy. Like, this is a 33-inch arms, prototypical, outside corner. But he didn't have the skills. He doesn't have the ability, at least from what we've seen in the NFL.
And we're talking about a corner that's going to turn 29 later this month.
Yeah, that was the other part of it, is that there's about, I think, probably a 6-year difference between him and Baker. I think Baker's 23 only, or 24. He's not that old.
No, he's not that old. I think he might be a little older than that, but he's significantly younger than Gareon Conley.
At least 5 years younger than Conley. So I tend to think that the Conley situation is a lot less appealing than Baker's, simply for all the reasons we mentioned. And I don't really see the upside, right? Like, I mean, even if you signed him and you felt like, I guess, good about him playing in an injury situation, do you feel good about him playing special teams, or do you feel good about any of that stuff? Because I don't know that I do. So I think that would be a tough situation.
The only other one that I thought was really interesting here is Willie Harvey, who played with the Browns as an undrafted free agent. He had a pass rush grade as an off-the-ball linebacker of 90. He was the 3rd highest graded linebacker in the UFL this season. Now, he's small. He's 6 foot 224 with 30-inch arms, and he'll turn 29 at the end of this season.
Yep.
But at least he seems like, of all of these players, he played probably the best. He was on the all UFL team.
I think he led the league in tackles.
If we're talking about the best player right now, it's probably Harvey, but I think Baker might be the best bet to
prospect, right?
Yeah, best prospect.
That's how you have to kind of look at it, right? Is that if I'm forming a team for me to play in the UFL, I'd probably take Harvey. If I'm forming a team to play in the NFL, and trying to like project, Baker is the guy that I have this is the guy I would want to invest in, right? Like not
Yes.
so much have on my team for this season. So I think for the Cowboys, they're looking at this situation as a potential multi-year project, right? So maybe you sign Harvey if you want him to like a short-term 1-year prove it deal,
Yeah.
right? And then
Just to
maybe
try to
you
compete for a spot in the roster.
exactly, and then maybe you sign Baker to a 2-year deal with an option or something, right?
Well, that's what they did with KaVontae Turpin. They
Yeah,
signed him to a
exactly.
3-year deal, and that way there wasn't a rush necessarily to feel like he had to play right away, but he did, of course.
That's right.
Uh,
And then they were glad they had that option, right?
yes.
It gave them the flexibility to have more cheap years. So I think that's likely possibility if they sign Baker as well.
The Cowboys have 2 open roster spots available right now. Who will they sign of these 4 UFL players? We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We are discussing the 4 UFL workouts that the Cowboys did on Tuesday. Later, let's make some predictions because I do think that the Cowboys will sign at least one of these players. Now, they can't sign any of the 4 until next week once the
Yeah.
UFL season is officially over and all the contracts are released. If you had to pick right now, who do you think the Cowboys will sign of this group?
I mean, I think it could be Baker. I mean, just because I think of these guys, he seems to be the most interesting prospect. Harvey to me wouldn't shock me either, just because they are, searching for linebackers. They need linebacker help this season. So maybe you think that you can get him, you've caught lightning in a bottle or something, and he can give you some good rotational snaps as a defender and I would assume as a special teamer as well. Those two make the most sense. I think in very kind of different scenarios, right? Like one is more of a immediate, depth piece at linebacker, and the other one is maybe a let's see what we can get out of this guy, maybe after developing him a little bit more with Baker. But I do think that to me, those are the two, as we've mentioned, that seem the most likely to end up with the Cowboys contract. I don't know about both, but I would imagine maybe one of those two.
Yeah, and I also don't believe that these are only the 4 players they're looking at with
No.
the UFL. These are just the ones that they were able to work out on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Maybe they were close or whatever the reasoning is. I think we're going to see ultimately the Cowboys show interest in some other positions outside of just linebacker and corner. But if I had to pick one, I'll probably go Harvey, just because you look at the numbers on this, the linebacker room. It's
Yep.
Eric Kendricks, who's older. It's Damone Clark. It's Overshown coming back from a torn ACL, which they're clearly going to try to limit him early on in training camp. They might even
Yep.
hold him out for the first week or two. And then it's Liafu, who they drafted in the 3rd round. I mean, you're talking about like 4 linebackers, 4 to 5 linebackers. You just need more bodies, right? Like you really need more guys that can help run practice. You need players so Eric Kendricks doesn't have to be out there every single day.
Yep.
So Overshown doesn't have to be out there. I do think Harvey's probably the most likely to get a shot on this roster.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, again, like, there's need there. There's obviously reason that they are checking 2 of these guys. They're trying to find somebody, and I guess, either of these guys are going to be kind of special teams players first, likely, if they make the roster, and then a kind of a depth piece. So, yeah, I do think it makes some sense to sign a guy like this where, he gives you a little bit more than just the guy that you would sign off the street, right? Because he's more motivated and he's,
Sure.
just a different player than what, the rest of the league has seen. So I like these kind of situations because sometimes maybe it's obviously cheaper situation, but also, the opportunity to get a guy that is desperate, that's willing to do whatever it takes to kind of make a team and make a roster and is not so secure in his bag, as it were.
Do you think there's a chance that they look at some of the other big name players at the position or on defense? I'm going to give you some names. Like
Mhm.
you and I were talking about Breland
Yeah.
Speaks, who led everybody in sacks in the UFL with 10. Taco Charlton was up there with 7. Just putting it out there. If you remember, like this, to me, this is what the UFL is for. Do you remember when the Cowboys had Rondell Carter, the edge rusher,
Yeah,
a few years
sure.
ago? He had
Yeah.
5 sacks, was the 8th highest graded edge rusher this year. Like, I think it's a perfect league for him. And I won't be surprised if, one of those kind of guys, Chris Odom is another one, makes it back onto a roster this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Breland Speaks is a guy that I was shocked to find out was in the UFL, but there he is, and obviously he's dominating. He's getting 10 sacks in there, so I hope he gets into the shot. There's other defenders, but also there's some offensive players too. I mean, Akeem Butler is a guy that has been mentioned. I think he was the UFL Offensive Player of the Year. He's the one that, if you've seen that kind of viral clip that's going around with Wade Phillips, that Wade's grabbing after a game and said, "Hey, you're a heck of a player. I'm going to tell everyone in the NFL about you." So there are guys out there, names that we would recognize that, especially if you're a draft Nick, guys who you watch a lot of their college tape are playing in the UFL right now. So, I think that we've mentioned some of these names, and I agree with you. I don't think that those 4 are the only 4 that the Cowboys are looking at. Those are the 4 that they had in for a workout on Tuesday. So I hope that they kick the tires a little bit on a Breland Speak, so I think would be a really great fit in this defense now, right? And frankly, a Rondell Carter too, as a guy that, if you remember correctly, he was an inside-outside guy, and even when he left the Cowboys, I think he ended up going to a couple different places and playing a similar role like that. I can't remember where he played afterwards, but he definitely hung around the league for a little bit. So I hope the Cowboys kind of take a look at all these guys, and that they are. And seeing if they can kind of backfill some of these spots cheaply. And again, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a guaranteed roster spot, just to get some of these guys in to kind of facilitate practice on almost like as an alternative to just a street tryout, right?
Yep.
Like I think is a good move, and it gives you an opportunity to get a guy that maybe is a little bit more ready to hit the ground running than your typical street free agent.
I've got one more that I wanted to mention before we go. So we've been talking about all offseason how we're looking for juice at running back. Anthony McFarland, who was a 4th round pick by the Steelers just a couple years ago. He's not big. He's 5'8", 195. So, he's not somebody that you want to give a lot of touches to. But he averaged 5.3 yards per carry in the UFL. He was fantastic as a receiver, only 25 years old. Like, those are the type of players that I would love to see the Cowboys take a chance on, because he was effective in the NFL when he got a chance. He was effective in the UFL. Why not bring him in? You don't really have anybody in the backfield that's like him right now that can give you some home run speed. I'm just going to be really curious to see what the Cowboys do over the next 2-3 weeks as they start to turn over or churn the roster, turn over every stone as they get ready for training camp. Should be a lot of fun. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. Go check out the YouTube channel. We post videos every day over there. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosier, and we'll see you next time.